What happens when a powerful black woman, one of the most respected CEOs in aviation, boards a flight incognito, only to be told, "You don't belong in first class"? She could have exploded. She could have walked off the plane in silence. But instead, she sat still, listened, and in just 30 minutes, made a decision that would change the airline forever. Why did an entire flight crew get fired mid-air? What secret power was Amara Jennings holding back? And why did she wait? This isn't just a story about racism at 30,000 feet. It's a story about calm resistance, silent dignity, and a woman who fought not with rage, but with her roots. What if your quietest moment became your loudest legacy? Before we begin this unforgettable journey, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that move hearts and open eyes. Now buckle up, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The cabin was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes with cruising altitude and noise-canceling headphones. This was different. This was the kind of quiet that followed shock, that held breath, that measured consequence. Amara Jennings stood near the front of the first-class cabin. Not towering, not raging, just standing, in a midnight blue suit that hugged her frame with elegance, calm hands at her sides, and eyes that carried decades of knowing. The words had already left her lips. "I own the airline you work for." They echoed in the chilled air like a slow-breaking wave, folding over the frozen expressions of the flight crew. A second passed, then another, across from her. Lindsay Mark's lead flight attendant blinked slowly. She held a silver service tray with both hands, but her fingers trembled, the stem of a half-empty champagne flute clinking against the polished surface. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Clinton Reeves, the purser, stood behind her. He had started to raise his hand as if to speak, but stopped midway. He looked at Amara's ID again, the company insignia gleaming from the badge she had just revealed, then at Lindsay, then at the captain, who stood frozen just outside the open cockpit door. The color had drained from his face, like a photograph losing contrast. Amara didn't yell. She didn't need to. The statement had landed harder than any shouted command. Row 2 was silent. Row 3 held its breath. A few phones were out, subtle but unmistakable. One tilted at just the right angle. From row 4, its camera catching everything, Amara's voice came again, low, firm, unwavering. Perhaps someone would like to explain why the CEO of North Atlantic Air was told she didn't belong in first class on her own aircraft. There it was, the wait, the pause, the punch not in tone, but in truth. Gerald Whitmore, the passenger who had triggered the whole cascade of indignities, shifted in his seat at 3C. His eyes dropped to the plastic cutlery on his tray, as though suddenly fascinated by scrambled eggs. Amara's ID still glinted under the cabin lights as she placed it back in her purse. Not her boarding pass, not a loyalty card, not a smile. Her title. She returned to her seat in 2A without another word. Nobody moved. But to understand how that moment came to exist, how a woman who had spent her entire life building a career through grit, brilliance, and grace, ended up having to declare her own authority mid-flight. We need to go back, not far, just a few hours, to a hotel room in Boston, to a chime at 4:15 a.m., and a change of plans. It had started, as these things so often did, with a shift no one had anticipated. The alarm was soft, but relentless. Amara's hand slid across the nightstand before her eyes had fully opened. The phone screen lit her face in a muted blue glow. 4:15 a.m. A new message. Flight 226 to San Francisco departure, updated 7:20. Oh, M. She blinked, sat up slowly. Her mind, still fogged with sleep, began the calculation. The leadership summit was at 10 Sur Pacific. They'd invited her to open the event, a strategic move, as North Atlantic's acquisition of a regional West Coast carrier had made headlines last month. She'd planned to fly out on the 8:30 route. But this change would put her in the air just in time. No room for delays. She sighed. No time to waste. Shifting the covers back, Amara moved with quiet precision. Years of travel had carved muscle memory into her mornings. She'd packed the night before. Always did. Her navy blue suit hung pressed and ready. The one she reserved for days with press cameras or board members. The white blouse was already steamed. Her shoes low, leather, and expensive, waited by the door. She let the hot water of the hotel shower clear the remaining fog from her mind. But even as she stepped out into the warm light of the bathroom, she could already feel the pressure creeping in. She dried her face, looked in the mirror, and reminded herself, control what you can. At 41, Amara Jennings had learned to move through the world with precision. Not just because she ran one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country, but because she was a black woman doing it. No room for off days. She applied just enough makeup to smooth the fatigue under her eyes. Slid in the small diamond studs her mother gave her when she finished her MBA. And when she zipped her carry-on, everything inside was sorted by need, not chance. Her assistant, Rhea, had already texted car confirmed. 5:30 pickup. Printouts in the front seat. SFO team will meet you at arrivals. Amara smiled. Worth every dollar I fought to get her. By the time she reached the hotel lobby, she had already cleared 3 emails and mentally rehearsed the first 2 slides of her presentation. The driver, Malcolm gray-haired, jazz-loving, with a southern lilt, opened the door before she even saw him. Morning, Miss Jennings. Flight change caught us both off guard. She slid in with a grateful nod. Let's see if we can outrun the schedule. He chuckled. Ain't no traffic this early. We'll be curbside in 20. As they pulled away, Amara watched the streetlights flicker against wet pavement. Boston was quiet at that hour, like it hadn't decided what kind of day it wanted to become. Neither had she, but the next 5 hours would make that choice for her. The sun hadn't risen yet when the town car pulled up to Boston Logan's departure level. The airport stirred with the low murmur of early travelers and rolling luggage wheels against tile. Amara stepped out into the chilled morning air, the collar of her coat rising slightly with the wind. Thank you, Malcolm, she said as he closed the trunk behind her. You go make 'em nervous today, he replied with a wink, tipping his cap. Let that airline of yours know who's running things. She smiled softly and nodded, tightening her grip on the leather handle of her carry-on. Inside, she moved through the terminal like someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. Because she had. But even now, even as CEO of North Atlantic Air, there was still that flicker of awareness when she approached security, that unspoken caution. Her TSA pre-check passed without incident, but not without notice. The ID check agent studied her driver's license a second too long, eyes flicking to her face, then back again. Not hostile, just surprised, as if her name, her face, her status didn't quite match the expectation. It was always there, subtle, lingering, like dust you could never quite wipe away. She adjusted the strap of her bag and walked toward Terminal B. Her gate wasn't crowded yet. Flight 226 to San Francisco sat at B-17. A few business travelers stood at the charging station with laptops open, sipping coffee with the grim efficiency of routine. A couple with matching backpacks napped against each other near the window. The boarding sign still read, "Departing 7:20 a.m." Amara found a quiet corner seat near the windows and let herself breathe for a moment. The hum of terminal announcements filled the space like white noise. She opened her laptop. The presentation was mostly done, but she wanted to rework slide 5. The data visualization needed tightening, maybe a clearer contrast bar. As she worked, the smell of brewed coffee from a nearby cafe caught her attention. A glance at her watch said 6:12. Enough time. She closed her laptop and made her way over to the cafe line. "Vanilla latte, almond milk," she told the barista, who nodded politely but didn't make eye contact. Nothing unusual, but nothing warm either. She stood waiting. The name on the cup called just a touch too flat. The letters scribbled slightly wrong. Amara. She didn't correct it. She just took her cup and walked back to her seat. As she passed gate B17 again, the digital screen flipped from on time to boarding soon. She caught a flicker of her reflection in the glass. Calm, controlled, but the tightness in her chest hadn't quite left. She resumed her place, coffee now warming her hand, and refreshed her inbox. 3 new emails, 1 from legal, 2 from operations. The second subject line caught her eye. Crew alignment delays. SFO segment. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. It was a known issue. Crew scheduling had been inconsistent since the company absorbed Westridge Air last fall. The operational systems hadn't fully integrated yet, and there were gaps crew showing up on mismatched rosters, duplicate assignments, undertrained replacements. She'd flagged it multiple times. Operations said it was under control. She opened the email and skimmed quickly. No solutions, just updates, just excuses. Her jaw tightened. She was still reading when she heard a voice say her name. Amara Jennings. She looked up, startled, to find a tall man with silver blonde hair, mid-50s, dressed in the standard executive casual blazer, pressed jeans, loafers standing near her. She blinked once before placing him. "The Aviation Tech Summit in Denver. Last year." "Yes," she said, standing. "You're with Aerosyn Systems." "Right, Ben Hargrave," he confirmed, extending his hand with a smile. "We met at the panel on predictive routing." "That's right. You were presenting the AI crew logic prototype. Still trying to convince your ops team to implement it," he said with a chuckle. She gestured to the seat across from her. "You're headed to San Francisco." He nodded, setting his coffee down. "Red-eye got me here. Flying back west now. You same. Leadership Summit. I'm opening the morning session. I heard congratulations. By the way, you're doing impressive things at North Atlantic. Not just saving a legacy brand, transforming it." Amara gave a modest nod. "Trying to—" "I meant what I said back in Denver," Ben continued, lowering his voice slightly. "Our system could clean up the chaos in your crew scheduling, cut delays by 12% minimum, but I think someone in ops is stalling." Amara's brow lifted slightly. "Who?" He shook his head. "Diplomatic. Let's just say, not everyone likes outside solutions." She leaned back, considering it wasn't the first time she'd heard a similar warning. Something was getting buried, brushed aside. "Email me again," she said finally. "Directly? I'll look into it." Ben smiled. "You got it. Good seeing you." "Amara, you too." "Ben, safe flight." He stood and walked toward the restroom, leaving behind the scent of citrus cologne and quiet affirmation. She sipped her latte and thought about the conversation. 12%. That kind of gain would offset over $20 million in projected inefficiencies. She made a mental note to pull up the crew performance metrics after the summit. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from Rhea. Car confirmed at SFO. Board folder in glove compartment. Security brief filed. Weather clear. Amara typed back, "Thanks, R. We'll message upon landing." Another update popped up from Gate B-17. Now boarding Group 1, first class and elite. She stood. The moment always felt strange. She'd traveled first class for years now. But there was still that echo from the past flights where people stared at her boarding pass like it couldn't be real. Where assumptions hung heavier than carry-ons. She walked to the gate, presented her phone. The agent scanned it with a mechanical smile. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Jennings." The jet bridge stretched before her, tunnel gray, humming faintly with machinery. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin was quiet and polished. Cream leather seats, soft blue lighting overhead. Her seat 2A sat by the window. She stowed her bag neatly, slid into her seat, and exhaled. A blonde flight attendant appeared with a practiced smile. "Good morning. Would you like orange juice or sparkling water? Before takeoff, orange juice." "Thank you," Amara replied. The attendant nodded and moved on. Moments later, a tray appeared beside her. A folded napkin. A glass of fresh juice. Then came the question. First time flying, first class, Amara's eyes lifted slowly. There it was. The question that arrived dressed in curiosity, but wore something else entirely beneath it. The implication that she didn't belong here. That her seat, her calm, her presence were somehow surprising. She answered without hesitation, her voice smooth. No, nothing else. The attendant blinked once, nodded, then continued down the aisle. Amara sipped her juice and turned to the window. Outside, the baggage carts moved with mechanical rhythm. A crew member waved a wand. The sky had shifted to gray. She closed her eyes for just a moment. The day had barely started, and already the balance was shifting. The hum of the cabin was steady, low, like the sound of calm before something you couldn't name. Amara watched quietly as more first-class passengers boarded. Most wore men's suits loosened, polished shoes, AirPods already in. A woman with platinum hair and an Hermes scarf adjusted her designer tote under the seat ahead. A young couple in tech hoodies laughed quietly while checking their phones. She glanced at the seat next to her. Empty for now. That was fine. She didn't mind the quiet. A few rows ahead. The crew prepared the galley. The blonde flight attendant, Lindsay, according to her name tag, hovered near the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. Her tone light, rehearsed. Everything about her said experienced, composed. But that same composure had felt brittle when she'd asked. First time in first class, Amara's phone buzzed again. A quick check. Rhea had sent a follow-up Westridge ops team asking to move Tuesday's debrief to virtual. Okay, she typed back. No, in person. Too much at stake. The merger had been delicate from the start. Westridge had resisted change like a body rejecting a transplant. But Amara didn't believe in half measures. You either aligned the culture or it collapsed from within. A sudden voice broke her focus. "Excuse me. I believe that's my seat." Amara looked up. A man stood in the aisle, tall, mid-50s, with silver-rimmed glasses and a confidence that filled the narrow space. His suit was tailored but worn, like something kept for routine travel rather than show. He held his boarding pass loosely in one hand, expression poised, not aggressive, but sure of himself. She glanced at her screen. "C2A. Yes," she said evenly. He tilted the pass toward her. "This is 2A. Correct, it is. Then I think you're in my seat." Amara didn't move. She held up her phone calmly, showing her digital boarding pass with the clear bold letters, 2A, Jennings. The man squinted, then frowned. That's strange. I always fly two-way on Tuesdays. Every week, for the last 6 years. Today is Thursday, she replied gently. He blinked. No. He paused, looked at his watch, then at the date on his boarding pass. His face stiffened. Amara could see the moment recognition hit him. April 18th. Not April 17th. Wrong day. Wrong flight. But instead of apologizing, he stood a little straighter. There must have been a mistake. He muttered, I was rebooked this morning. They must have given me the wrong seat. You might want to speak to the gate agent, Amara said, still calm. This flight was rescheduled overnight. They sent notifications. His lips tightened. His eyes moved back to her seat, then to her face. She saw it just for a moment. That flicker of resistance, that question he wanted to ask but didn't, that weight in his silence. Then, without another word, he turned and walked up the aisle toward the front. Amara leaned back in her seat. Behind her, a low chuckle floated over the aisle. Some people really struggle with change. She turned slightly. A gentleman in 2B had settled in white, late 70s, book in hand. He gave her a small nod of greeting. Well-worn routines can be hard to let go, he added. She smiled. Just barely. Apparently, the man closed his book briefly, studying her with kind eyes. I'm Lionel Pratt, Amara Jennings. He offered his hand. She shook it. I fly this route once a month. He said, visiting my daughter in Oakland. She just had twin boys, 6 weeks old. Congratulations, Amara said sincerely. Thanks. I used to drive it back in the day, but after my second hip surgery, I figured it was time to let someone else do the heavy lifting. What did you do before retirement, she asked. Taught history, he said with a smile. Berkeley, mostly. Some visiting lectures at Yale and Howard. My focus was social movements, especially Reconstruction through civil rights. Amara raised an eyebrow. Impressed. That's quite the span. It's all the same movement, really. Just different chapters. She let the words settle. A beat passed. I work in aviation, she said simply, not volunteering more. But Lionel only nodded. Good industry. Fast-paced. High pressure. He gestured toward her carry-on, tucked perfectly under the seat. You travel like someone who's done this 1,000 times. Amara smiled. Something like that. The gate agent returned moments later, following the man from earlier, Gerald. She thought she heard someone call him. The gate agent's tone was professional, but firm. Mr. Whitmore, as I explained, your original flight was canceled this morning. The system automatically rebooked you on the next available departure. It appears your usual seat, 2A, had already been assigned. You're currently ticketed for 3C. I've flown 2A every Tuesday for 6 years, Gerald repeated, as if repetition might rewrite fact. I understand. But today is Thursday. We had a network disruption overnight. I don't sit in 3C, he said, voice now rising slightly. It's a first-class seat, sir. It's not my seat. Amara stared straight ahead, saying nothing. The gate agent turned to her briefly and offered a small apologetic smile. Lionel cleared his throat softly beside her. Gerald Whitmore finally relented, muttering something under his breath as he made his way to 3C, shoulders stiff. Once he'd passed, Lionel leaned toward her again, voice low. Entitlement is a hell of a drug. Amara huffed a quiet laugh, then shook her head. He'll be glaring at me the entire flight. Then let him glare. Lionel said, You've got work to do. She smiled again. This time, with warmth. The rest of the boarding process moved quickly. The cabin filled. Business people, lawyers, retired couples, a young man in a Patagonia vest chatting about venture capital, a woman in pearls with a wedding magazine. Amara took it in, quietly. The demographics hadn't changed much in 20 years. White, older, mostly male. She could count the passengers of color on one hand. And even then, the looks she'd received already said enough. Assumptions move faster than facts. She opened her laptop, trying to refocus. Slide 5 still bothered her. She began reworking the color contrast on the market share graph. But her concentration broke when Lindsay appeared at her seat again. "Ma'am," Lindsay said, voice light. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Amara turned slowly. "Yes," she said. Why just a routine verification? Lindsay's eyes flicked toward Gerald. Amara didn't move. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "No, not at all," Lindsay replied too quickly. But Amara could feel it. The shift. The moment when the air changed. When courtesy became control. She unlocked her phone. Displayed the boarding pass. Lindsay looked at it for longer than necessary. And, "Your ID as well, please." The cabin around them quieted. Lionel turned in his seat, his mouth pressing into a thin line. Amara said nothing. She reached slowly into her purse and handed over her ID. Lindsay compared it. Twice. From behind them. A woman's voice spoke up. Midwest accent. Steady and smug. "They're just making sure everyone's where they're supposed to be." The words were quiet, but not quiet enough. Amara didn't respond. She only accepted her ID back and turned back to her screen. The laptop stared back at her with an open presentation about innovation, inclusion, and service excellence. She closed it gently and sat in silence. The flight hadn't even taken off yet, but it was already soaring towards something far more complicated than altitude. The cabin door closed with a deep, final thunk. The kind of sound that always seemed to carry weight, not just mechanical weight, but emotional, as if, with that single seal, the world inside the aircraft was cut off from the one it left behind. Amara felt the difference almost immediately. The background noise of the terminal vanished. Now there was only the filtered air, the murmur of passengers settling into their seats, and the soft tone of the overhead chime as the safety video began to play. Lindsay stood at the front of the aisle, her hands folded neatly, reciting instructions with a practiced cadence. Her voice, sweet and firm, somehow felt sharper now. Amara kept her eyes on the tablet in her lap, pretending to review her slides while trying to steady her breath. She was not unfamiliar with these kinds of encounters, but that didn't make them easier. She'd learned over the years that injustice rarely came in a shout. More often, it came dressed in protocol, in smiles, in questions that sounded neutral but landed like slaps. She'd lost count of how many times she'd been asked to explain herself to prove she belonged in rooms she was hired to lead. This one just happened to be at 36 feet. As the video ended, the aircraft pulled back from the gate. The gentle hum of the engines rising felt like a heartbeat beside her. Lionel adjusted his seatbelt. He didn't speak, but his eyes flicked toward her, full of quiet understanding. Amara felt the corners of her mouth lift faintly, a gesture of gratitude without words. The aircraft accelerated. Amara leaned back. Her body pulled gently into the seat as the plane rose above the city lights and into the morning sky. As soon as the seatbelt sign clicked off, Lindsay passed through the cabin again, checking on each row with a bright, "Can I get you anything, Wah?" When she reached Amara's row, her tone cooled ever so slightly. Would you care for breakfast? Ma'am. Amara nodded once. Eggs, please. And black coffee. Lindsay didn't make eye contact. I'll be right back. When she returned, it wasn't alone. Nia, a younger flight attendant, dark-skinned, with a short natural cut and gentle eyes, followed behind her, carrying a tray. The difference in energy between them was immediate. Nia smiled as she set the tray down in front of Amara. Eggs and coffee. Miss Jennings, cream and sugar on the side, just in case. Amara looked up. Nia's gaze held something more than courtesy. It was recognition. Thank you, Amara said softly. Before Nia could respond, Lindsay leaned in again. Nia, I think we might be short on egg breakfasts. Can you double-check the manifest? Nia blinked. We should have enough. I pre-counted. Please just check again, Lindsay said, her voice flat but loaded. Amara looked between the two women. Nia hesitated, then nodded and turned to walk back toward the galley. Lionel watched the exchange, brow furrowed. Lindsay lingered a moment longer than necessary, then walked off. Amara picked up her coffee slowly. She hadn't even taken a sip when she heard the voice from behind her. I can't believe they're making such a fuss. It was a woman's voice. Quiet, but not whispered. Midwest accent. Familiar in its certainty. You know how it is, a man replied. People get defensive when they're out of place. Amara said nothing. She stared ahead, forcing herself to take a long, slow breath through her nose. Lionel leaned toward her. Just slightly. Ignore it, he said gently. It's poison. Not worth breathing in. She nodded once, grateful for his presence. But inside, her stomach clenched. She picked up her fork and forced herself to eat. Each bite tasted like cardboard. She didn't want to let them win. But the truth was, it was exhausting to be examined, questioned, watched, then blamed for the tension that others had caused. She finished half the tray and pushed it aside. Nia returned quietly a few minutes later. We had enough, she said softly, under her breath as she cleared the tray. As I thought, Amara gave her a quiet look, the kind that said, I see you. Nia returned it with a slight nod. The language of knowing, of being one of the few in a system designed to exclude, as the cabin quieted again. Amara turned back to her tablet. The screen glowed softly in the dim light. She stared at the slide with the words cultural integration and accountability. The irony made her jaw clench. She heard Clinton Reeves, the purser, approaching the front cabin. He was tall, narrow-shouldered, wearing the perfectly pressed uniform of a man who prided himself on appearances. As he passed Gerald Whitmore in 3C, Amara noticed how his face lit up. Good to see you again, sir. Hope your morning's going well, Clinton said, with an easy grin. Gerald smiled in return. Well enough. Bit of a seat mix-up, but I suppose that's all sorted. Clinton chuckled. We do our best to keep things running smoothly. Amara watched them, expression unreadable. When Clinton reached her row, he offered a courteous nod. Everything all right for you, ma'am? His tone was pleasant, but it rang hollow. Yes, thank you, she replied, matching his emptiness with her own. He continued his check, stopping to chat again with the woman behind her, the one who had commented earlier. Amara looked out the window. Below them, the Midwest sprawled like a quilt. Flat towns, frozen rivers, patches of snow still clinging to spring fields. She let her mind wander briefly, back to her first job out of grad school, back to the nights she spent in empty offices, working twice as hard to be seen as half as capable. Back to the boardroom where she'd pitched the regional merger, where she'd been told, kindly but firmly, that it was too ambitious. She had made it happen anyway. And now here she was, still explaining herself, still defending her right to sit in a seat she had earned 10 times over. The seatbelt sign dinged on again. "This is your captain speaking," came a calm voice overhead. "We're expecting some light turbulence ahead as we cross into Colorado airspace. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin." The aircraft shuddered softly as if to confirm the message. Amara tightened her belt. Outside, the clouds thickened. Shadows spilled over the wing. Nia passed through once more, checking belts, her steps light even in turbulence. She gave Amara a subtle look as she passed. A half smile. "Just hold on." Amara nodded, almost imperceptibly. The plane jolted once, then steadied. Lionel returned to his book, but she could see his hands resting just above the pages, not quite turning. He was watching, listening. Amara closed her eyes. She thought of her parents, of how her mother had once said, "There will be rooms where they try to shrink you. Stand twice as tall in them." But it was hard. Some days it was so hard. The slide on her screen still glowed softly, words frozen in place. Inclusion isn't a word. It's a practice. She stared at it for a long time, then tapped the screen off. They would be flying over the Rockies soon. And something else was coming with the clouds. Something neither quiet nor subtle. It wasn't done yet. But it would be soon. The turbulence had mostly passed, but the tension in the air hadn't. It hung there, subtle but charged, like the low pressure before a storm. The flight was quiet, unusually so for a morning run between two busy cities. Amara sat upright in her seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed, but mind racing. She wasn't tired, not physically, but emotionally. She felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Exhaustion. Not from the job. Not even from the politics of leadership or long negotiations. It was the weight of constantly having to earn a place in spaces she'd already claimed. The cost of moving through the world is both invisible and hyper-visible at once. From the aisle, she felt eyes on her again. Gerald Whitmore, 3 rows back, was watching, pretending not to, but watching nonetheless. His pride had been bruised earlier when she refused to vacate the seat he thought belonged to him. And though the gate agent had confirmed everything in plain terms, it was clear he hadn't let it go. People like Gerald rarely did. They held on to discomfort like a rope. Not because it kept them safe, but because letting go would mean facing something too unsettling. That maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't built entirely around their preferences anymore. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am." She opened her eyes. Nia stood beside her, her face unreadable but polite. "We're offering hot towels before meal service begins again." Amara nodded. Nia handed her the towel gently, fingers brushing hers for a second longer than protocol required. Just enough to say, "I see you." Amara offered a faint smile. "Thank you." Behind Nia, Lindsay appeared again. Her eyes moved between the two women. Her smile returned, but it was thinner this time. "Nia, can I have a word with you in the galley?" Nia blinked. Of course. The two walked to the back. Amara returned the towel to the tray and exhaled slowly. Lionel leaned a little closer. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, a bit too quickly. "I've dealt with worse." He nodded. "Still doesn't make it right." She didn't answer, but she appreciated him saying it. Across the aisle, someone cleared their throat. Then again, louder. It was the woman from earlier. Pearls, pink cashmere sweater, and judgment radiating from her posture like perfume. "Excuse me, flight attendant," the woman called out. Lindsay appeared. Instantly, "Yes, ma'am." The woman pointed toward Amara. "I think there's been a mistake. This woman didn't seem to have the correct identification earlier. Are we sure she's supposed to be here?" Amara froze. Lionel inhaled sharply beside her. Before Lindsay could speak, Gerald chimed in from behind. "I had the same concern. Actually, she showed something on her phone. But these days, people forge everything." Amara turned her head slowly. Her voice was even, but her eyes were cold steel. "My ticket was scanned twice. My ID was verified, and I was assigned this seat through official channels. If you have further questions, I suggest directing them to the captain or Federal Aviation authorities." The words hung in the air. Lindsay offered a nervous laugh. "Let's not escalate. I'm sure we're all just no," Amara said. "Let's be clear. The issue here is not confusion. It's comfort." She stood. The cabin quieted completely. "You are uncomfortable because I do not match the story you've written in your head about who belongs in this seat." Gerald blinked, clearly not expecting to be addressed directly. The woman in pearl shrunk slightly, but held her ground. Amara took one step into the aisle, steady and calm. "I am not your maid. I am not a misplaced guest. I am not here by accident." She turned to Lindsay. "And if you continue allowing these insinuations to happen without correction, then you are complicit." Lindsay's face turned a shade paler. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to do my job." "No," Amara said. "Your job is to ensure safety, service, and dignity for every passenger. Not just the ones who look like you. Not just the ones you personally understand." Silence, then a slow, deliberate clap. Lionel. He didn't stop clapping until others joined in. Not everyone, but enough to shift the air. 2 rows back, a young Latina woman nodded. A few seats down, a black man in business attire gave a small thumbs up. Even Nia, who had returned quietly, stood frozen near the galley, her eyes shimmering. Amara sat back down slowly. She didn't want applause. She didn't need vindication. She wanted decency. Clinton Reeves appeared moments later, his posture suddenly much stiffer. "I've just spoken to the captain," he said, addressing her. "He'd like to offer you a complimentary drink of your choice for the inconvenience." Amara didn't blink. "Tell the captain I'd prefer he offer a public apology to every black and brown passenger who's ever had to prove their humanity midair." Clinton swallowed hard. "I'm afraid I don't have the authority to." "You don't," she agreed. "But I do." He tilted his head slightly. "Excuse me." Amara opened her carry-on bag, pulled out a thin leather folder, and handed it to him. Inside was a laminated ID badge. Clinton stared at it, then blinked twice. "Chairwoman of the board, North Atlantic Aviation Holdings." His mouth parted slightly. Color drained from his face. I didn't realize." "Of course you didn't." She didn't say it cruelly, just honestly, because that was the point. She wasn't supposed to be someone worth noticing. Not in their eyes, not in their assumptions. Amara turned to Lindsay. "Gather your crew," she said, her voice low but firm. "I need to speak with you." "Now." Lindsay hesitated, then nodded stiffly. The murmurs began again. Passengers glancing, whispering, but no one interrupted. The energy had changed. Something had cracked, and Amara hadn't even raised her voice. 10 minutes later, Lindsay, Clinton, and 2 additional attendants gathered near the galley. Nia stayed behind, instinctively sensing she wasn't part of the reprimand. Amara remained seated, but her voice carried just enough. What happened here today is not unique, but it is unacceptable. Clinton looked like he wanted to disappear. I'm initiating a review of this flight's conduct. I've already informed legal and executive. You'll be hearing from both. Chairwoman Jennings, Lindsay began. I assure you. No, Amara said softly. Don't assure me. Reflect. And then decide if you belong in a role that requires empathy. The words cut deeper than volume ever could. Amara stood slowly and returned to her seat. Lionel watched her with admiration that required no words. You didn't flinch, he said quietly. Amara finally exhaled. I've spent years learning not to. But even as she said it, her hands trembled ever so slightly in her lap. Not from fear, but from the sheer force of holding it all together. From the ache of always having to be the one who teaches others how to be human. Outside the window, the sun pierced through the clouds over the Rockies. Sharp, bright, unapologetic, just like her. The announcement came without warning. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to unforeseen operational matters, we'll be making an unscheduled landing in Denver. Estimated arrival time is 23 minutes. Please remain in your seats and follow the instructions of the crew. We apologize for the inconvenience. The cabin fell into a stunned silence. Denver people began whispering immediately. A couple in 4A glanced at each other in confusion. Gerald straightened in his seat like someone trying to eavesdrop on fate. Amara didn't move. She knew exactly what this was. This wasn't weather. It wasn't fuel. It wasn't anything mechanical. This was power shifting. And the captain, whoever he was, had made a decision that would ripple through every rank of this airline. She looked to Lionel, who met her gaze with a calm question in his eyes. She offered the smallest nod. Yes, she had requested this. No, she hadn't planned it, but she was prepared. A soft chime signaled the seatbelt sign returning. Outside, the Rocky Mountains drifted beneath them like ancient bones wrapped in snow. Amara had always admired mountains, not just for their size, but for their silence, their refusal to shrink for anyone. The cabin crew moved through the aisles, their energy suddenly more clipped. There was a frantic edge in Clinton Reeves now. He no longer looked like the polished purser who charmed business-class elites. He looked like a man calculating how long he had before the ground caught up with him. He paused as he passed Amara again. Chairwoman Jennings, he said, trying to sound composed. I assure you, the captain's decision is unrelated. He was already reviewing some compliance concerns. Amara stared at him with the same calm she had carried all morning. Clinton, you don't need to lie. Just make sure you're packed when we land. He opened his mouth, closed it. Nia passed by moments later, gently checking belts and tray tables. She paused beside Amara. Her voice dropped low, just above a whisper. Whatever happens down there, thank you. Amara met her eyes. What's your name? She asked. Nia Wallace. She replied, I've only been flying 7 months. Well, Amara said, you've just ensured you'll be flying a lot longer. She saw the tears gather in Nia's eyes, but the young woman blinked them away and nodded sharply before continuing her walk. 20 minutes later, the wheels touched down in Denver. The landing was smooth but firm, deliberate. The moment the aircraft cleared the runway, a voice from the cockpit returned. We've been directed to taxi to a private gate. Please remain seated until further notice. Ground staff will be boarding shortly. That word. Directed. Not requested. Directed. Amara sat still as the plane rolled along a quiet edge of the airfield. Outside the window, the usual gates and bustling terminals disappeared. This wasn't the commercial wing. This was executive ground. Isolated. Controlled. When the engines powered down and the lights dimmed slightly, passengers grew restless. Murmurs became questions. The pink-sweatered woman was asking her husband if they were being detained. Then the door opened, not to passengers, but to three individuals in tailored black suits. They didn't look like TSA. They looked like corporate, internal affairs, senior executive ops. The lead woman wore a slim headset and held a tablet in one hand. Her name tag read Maria Lynn. She moved forward quickly, stopping directly in front of Amara's seat. "Chairwoman Jennings," she said, nodding respectfully, "I'd like to begin the internal crew audit immediately." "Shall we proceed?" Amara stood slowly, smoothing the crease in her jacket. "Yes. Let's begin in the galley." The cabin watched in stunned silence as she walked forward, followed by Maria Lynn and her team. Lindsay, Clinton, and the remaining crew were gathered at the front. Only Nia remained seated in the jump seat near the back, eyes forward, untouched. Amara stopped just short of the galley. Her voice never rose. "I'm invoking Clause 7 of the North Atlantic Service Protocol, which authorizes real-time removal of personnel for conduct inconsistent with federal compliance and brand integrity." Lindsay opened her mouth but was cut off. Maria stepped forward, tapping her tablet. "We've reviewed initial documentation, passenger testimony, recorded interactions from the cabin camera system, and crew conduct logs. Based on that, we are suspending Lindsay Marks, Clinton Reeves, and crew member Daniel Everett from all in-flight operations effective immediately." What Clinton gasped. "You can't do this mid-air," Lindsay said, her voice rising. "We're not mid-air," Amara replied. "We're very much grounded." A sharp silence fell. Maria continued, her voice clinical. "Security will escort you off the aircraft. Your belongings will be forwarded. You'll be contacted within 24 hours for a formal HR hearing. Daniel Everett, a younger crew member who had barely spoken the entire flight, stepped forward. This is ridiculous. She didn't even look like he stopped himself. But it was too late. Amara's eyes narrowed. "Say it." Daniel hesitated, cheeks flushing. I just meant..." She didn't look like someone who'd be in charge of all this. There it was. Amara turned to Maria. "Add that to the file." Daniel paled. As the three were led off the aircraft, the cabin exploded with sound, whispers, questions, even applause from a few passengers who had quietly observed every humiliation and every silent restraint. Amara turned to the rest of the cabin. Her voice was soft but powerful. "For those of you wondering, yes, I am the chairwoman of this airline. And no, I don't normally fly commercial. But today was about observation, about truth." She paused. "For too long, behavior like this has been buried in forms, excuses, and deniability. But not anymore. Not under my watch." The cabin went still. She nodded toward the intercom panel near the cockpit door. "Would you mind if I address the passengers?" Maria. Maria handed her a wireless mic. Amara turned it on and took a breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "thank you for your patience during this unexpected stop. I know this is not how you planned to begin your day, but sometimes justice takes up space, and sometimes that space is a runway in Denver." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "There is a culture in our skies that reflects the worst of the world below. It is not built in one day, but it can begin to unravel in one. And today is that day. Silence. Then applause. Soft, at first, then louder. Nia turned her head just enough to catch Amara's eyes and smiled. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the silence had been broken. And from the ground up, change had finally begun. The plane remained grounded in Denver for just over 30 minutes. Enough time for 3 crew members to be removed. A new interim purser flown in from standby, and a stream of texts and alerts to light up across North Atlantic Air's corporate headquarters in Manhattan. But up in the cabin, time moved differently. Passengers sat quietly, processing the surreal sequence of events. Some were stunned, some grateful, others resentful, but everyone knew they had witnessed something unusual, something unspoken that had finally found its voice. Amara sat in her seat again, eyes closed, her fingers gently pressed together. Her breathing was measured, controlled, but inside, she wasn't calm, not really. She was reflecting on everything, on how even now, even after everything she had built, there were people who still looked at her and saw someone temporary, someone accidental, someone out of place. She had tried for years to believe that dignity was earned, that credentials and hard work were armor against ignorance. But today reminded her of the truth she had carried since her earliest days in corporate America. You can't outperform a closed mind. You can only confront it. And that confrontation had come at 35,000 feet. Lionel leaned toward her gently. You've got a storm brewing in that mind of yours. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly. Always. Did you ever imagine this day would come? He asked when she thought for a moment. I imagined worse. So maybe that's why I kept building? Lionel nodded slowly. What they did today, there's a special kind of cruelty and humiliation dressed as protocol. Amara glanced toward the front of the cabin. It's never about the rules. It's about who they're enforced against. Just then, her phone buzzed on silent. A message from Ava Ramsey, her chief of operations. Ava Media has the story. Passenger filmed the confrontation. Twitter is exploding. Do you want to respond publicly? Yet Amara stared at the message for a long moment. She didn't reply. She wasn't ready. Not yet. At the rear of the plane, Nia Wallace was cleaning out the galley quietly when a call came through on the intercom from the captain. Miss Wallace, please report to the cockpit. She paused, unsure what to expect. When she arrived, the captain stood with his arms folded. He was older, mixed race, with a quiet gravity about him. You flew with integrity today, he said simply, and you did it while navigating waters most people pretend don't exist. Nia blinked. I was just trying to do the right thing. Well, he said. The chairwoman noticed, and so did we. He handed her a folded envelope. Inside was a printed letter of commendation signed by the executive board. She stared at it, stunned. But I'm probationary. I've only done 7 rotations. The captain smiled. You'll be leading one soon. Down in seat 2A. Amara was checking her calendar when another message came in. AVA Gerald Whitmore just posted on LinkedIn. He's claiming he was bullied by airline leadership for raising reasonable safety concerns. Comments are catching fire. He's framing it as reverse discrimination. Amara sighed. Of course he was. People like Gerald rarely back down. Instead, they shapeshifted, turning from aggressor to victim, flipping narratives like cards in a deck. She clicked the link Ava sent. There it was, a long, self-pitying post, complete with carefully chosen words, professionalism, misunderstanding, overreaction, and most galling of all, dignity. He had no idea the word he used was the very one he had tried to steal. Amara turned to Lionel. "He's trying to control the story." Lionel read the post, lips curling in quiet disdain. "Well, then maybe it's time you tell yours." She looked out the window again, her reflection faint against the sunlit glass. There was a time when she would have let it go, stayed silent, remained behind the curtain of corporate grace. But that time was over. She opened a blank note on her phone and began to write. Not a press release, not a rebuttal, but a story. She wrote about being followed through high-end stores in her youth, about being mistaken for someone's assistant, even as she chaired board meetings, about being told she spoke well or was so articulate as if language were borrowed and not hers. She wrote about the silent calculations black professionals make daily. When to speak, when to let it go, when to remind people of who they are, and when that reminder becomes a threat. And then she wrote about today, what it felt like to be stripped of identity midair, what it meant to reclaim it in front of the very people who tried to take it. When she finished, she didn't edit it. She just pressed share. The post went up under her personal name. No filters, no logos, just truth. By the time the plane lifted off again, her message had reached over 30,000 views, and rising, back in economy. Gerald was fuming in silence. His phone buzzed nonstop. Comments under his post were turning. Some supported him, of course, but others were now linking to Amara's story. Screenshots from the passenger video had begun surfacing, and there he was, standing, pointing, demanding identification. The angle was unflattering, but the implication was clear. He hadn't asked for accountability. He had demanded submission, and people could see that now. He turned toward Amara, who hadn't looked back once. She wasn't gloating. She was working. That made it worse. At the front of the cabin. Nia quietly approached Amara's seat. She knelt slightly, just enough for privacy. "Chairwoman Jennings," she whispered, "when this all settles, if you ever need someone to join your internal culture task force, I'd volunteer." Amara looked at her with quiet warmth. "You just did." And something passed between them then. Not just recognition, but promise. This wasn't about one flight anymore. This was about the next 1,000, about changing what it meant to fly while black, to work while brown, to serve while unseen, and for the first time in a long while. Amara felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Hope, not for herself, but for the sky she was helping to rebuild. One policy, one story, one person at a time. The plane touched down in Chicago just after noon, taxiing into Gate 47B under a sky smeared with pale gray clouds. The silence in the cabin was heavy with expectation. Even as the wheels kissed the tarmac, it felt like the real landing had not yet happened. From the moment they reached the gate, Amara noticed the difference. There were more ground staff than usual, all in navy blazers with discreet security earpieces. 2 were stationed directly outside the jet bridge door. The moment the main cabin door opened, one of them stepped in and whispered something into the interim purser's ear. The purser turned, nodded once, then walked briskly down the aisle to where Amara sat. "Chairwoman Jennings," he said respectfully, "there are members of the press outside. They were tipped off about the earlier incident and are requesting a comment. The airport has also received word from our PR division. Apparently your post went viral." Amara closed her eyes briefly. Steadying herself, she hadn't planned to speak publicly. Not here, not yet. But the moment had arrived all the same. "How many cameras?" she asked softly. 6, maybe more. Local networks, a few online outlets, and, he hesitated, CNN. Lionel leaned toward her. You don't have to speak. She looked up. I know, she said. That's why I will. She rose with grace, smoothing the lines of her deep blue suit jacket. Her heels clicked softly on the aisle as she walked toward the front. Every head turned as she passed. Some passengers whispered, others pulled out phones, but no one said a word aloud. When she stepped into the jet bridge, a wave of sound hit her, the rush of cameras flashing, voices calling her name, microphones being extended. Chairwoman Jennings, did you fire the crew? Is it true you were mistaken for a flight attendant? Is North Atlantic facing a civil rights lawsuit? Do you feel safe traveling on your own airline? Her hand went up gently, and for some reason, they stopped, just like that. Silence. She took 2 steps forward, stopping just short of the main cluster of reporters. A portable mic was extended. She took it slowly, held it in both hands, and breathed. I didn't come on this flight expecting to speak, she said. I didn't come looking for headlines. I came looking for honesty. The crowd stilled. This morning, I boarded one of my own aircraft under a different name, not as a test, not as a game, but as a reality check, because every executive in this country should be willing to experience their service the way their most vulnerable customer does. She paused. Her voice was soft, but it carried, and what I found was not a service issue. It was a human issue, an identity issue, an issue that lives in quiet assumptions and loud dismissals. That tells someone like me that unless I'm wearing a name badge or delivering coffee, I don't belong in seat 2A. The press held still. Amara continued, her voice steady. We speak about diversity. We post about inclusion. We sponsor conferences and print manuals. But unless our actions match our slogans, those words are just wallpaper over a cracked foundation. She glanced to the side, where several airport staff had gathered to watch. What happened today wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's ever been asked to prove they belong somewhere they already earned. Someone from CNN stepped forward. Chairwoman Jennings, were you humiliated by what happened? Amara looked at the reporter for a long moment. I was disappointed, she said, but I wasn't surprised. And that's the problem. Another reporter asked, what do you say to those claiming this was a setup? Amara tilted her head slightly. If observing discrimination is considered a setup, then we've normalized it so deeply that truth feels like sabotage. Gas rippled through the small crowd. A young black woman near the back of the press pool wiped her eyes discreetly. I'm not interested in punishing, Amara added. I'm interested in transforming, and that means accountability. It means retraining. It means rethinking how we value presence, voice, and difference. Her voice softened, and if that makes some people uncomfortable, that's okay. Growth should be uncomfortable. She handed the mic back. The crowd stood frozen, unsure whether to clap or stay silent. In the end, a single round of applause started from the far right, joined quickly by several others. Within seconds, the jet bridge was filled with clapping, muted at first, then louder, rising like waves crashing against years of quiet. Amara didn't linger. She turned, stepped back into the plane, and headed toward the exit at the rear, away from the flashbulbs and cameras. Gerald watched her from row 12, slack-jawed. No one had approached him for comment. No one had asked for his side of the story. His post had already been ratioed on every platform. Screenshots from the incident had trended for hours. Even his own firm had issued a statement saying they were reviewing the matter with seriousness. The silence around him now wasn't peaceful. It was judgment. He tapped his phone angrily, trying to comment on a thread. But the words felt useless. He had lost control, back at the rear of the plane. Amara paused just before stepping onto the tarmac. Nia Wallace stood there, holding the galley handle. She looked at her with both admiration and curiosity. "How did you stay that calm?" she asked softly. Amara smiled. "Because this wasn't about me, Nia. It was about the 10,000 people after me who can't speak up when they're made invisible." Nia nodded slowly. "And because I've had years of practice." Then she touched Nia's shoulder. "You keep doing what you're doing. One day, you won't just be working this plane. You'll be flying it." As Amara stepped onto the tarmac, a gentle breeze brushed against her face. For the first time all day, she let herself feel tired, not from confrontation, but from carrying restraint. She exhaled slowly. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried, and a mother hushed it gently. Another plane took off, and the sky, vast and open as ever, waited for her return. 2 hours after Amara's impromptu statement at Chicago O'Hare, North Atlantic Air's headquarters in Manhattan was humming like a struck bell. There were legal consultations in conference rooms, emergency PR meetings on the top floor, HR fielding inquiries about policies dating back 5 years. The board's private Slack channel had nearly 100 unread messages, half of them variations of one urgent question. Did she really post that? Yes, and she meant every word. Amara hadn't returned to her corner office. She'd gone to the executive lounge on the 26th floor, a quiet space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the afternoon sky darken, remembering another room long ago, one without windows, one where no one had listened. She had been 29, one of the youngest vice presidents at Meldon Aerospace, fresh out of Harvard Business and the first black woman to be promoted to corporate strategy at that level. She'd worked 80-hour weeks, traveled to 12 countries in 6 months, and had just closed a $40 million acquisition deal in Dubai. And then, that day, she had walked into a boardroom full of men who barely looked up from their papers when she arrived. She'd been asked to fetch extra packets for a pitch meeting she was presenting. One director mistook her for catering. Another asked who she was shadowing. She had introduced herself. They laughed. And when she began her presentation, one of them said, "Let's wait for the real speaker." That moment had never left her. It wasn't the dismissal that stung. It was the way they made her feel like she was trespassing on her own future. Like the building was never built for someone like her to own the blueprint. Back in the lounge, her phone buzzed. It was Ava. "The board wants a closed door tonight. Just you and them." 8p. Ma'am. Amara didn't flinch. "Of course. They're rattled. They should be. They're asking if you plan to resign." That made her pause. Ava let the silence sit. "I'm not stepping down," Amara said finally. "But I'm done stepping around." "Good," Ava whispered, "because they're watching now." At exactly 8 o'clock, Amara entered the executive boardroom polished walnut table, 12 leather chairs, glass walls with automatic tinting. Half the board was already seated, murmuring softly among themselves. Bryce Halloway, the board chairman, sat at the head, mid-60s, with a silver mane and tired blue eyes. He looked at Amara like a man both proud and afraid of her. "Amara," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him, "thank you for making time." She didn't smile. "Let's talk plainly." "Bryce, I have nothing to hide. The head of legal..." Monica Graham cleared her throat. You understand the board's concern. A post like that, in the middle of a flight. You bypassed internal protocols. You made a public statement that implicated the airline. It opens us up to what Amara interrupted. Accountability. A murmur ran through the room. Bryce raised his hand. We're not here to attack. We're here to understand. Amara leaned forward. What happened on that flight didn't begin on that flight. It began with a culture that tolerates bias behind the shield of procedure. It began the day we decided it was safer to apologize in private than take a stand in public. She locked eyes with each person at the table. Tell me something. If I hadn't posted that message, would any of you even know what happened on board? No one spoke. Monica shifted uncomfortably. There are ways to report these things internally. And how many anonymous reports go unread? How many microaggressions buried under misunderstandings? Still, no answer. She pressed on. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking for your courage. Because if we don't name what's broken, we cannot fix it. Bryce sighed. And what exactly do you want to fix? Amara stood, walked slowly toward the screen on the wall, tapped her phone. A slide lit up. Operation Altitude. It was her plan. A sweeping internal audit of crew behavior patterns, real-time discrimination response systems, bias sensitivity, recertification for all cabin staff. A new advisory council of employees across race, gender, and role, not just executives, and a commitment to publicly disclose quarterly data on misconduct and reform. The board blinked. You've had this ready, Monica asked. For years, Amara said softly. But I was waiting for the moment you'd listen. Silence again. Bryce nodded slowly. You realize this won't go over quietly. Investors will question the narrative. Then let them, Amara said. We are not just flying passengers. We are shaping what it means to be seen. There was a long pause. Then Bryce leaned back and folded his arms. We vote at dawn. Amara nodded once and left. Outside the boardroom, Ava was waiting. She handed Amara a glass of water. You did it. I said it. Whether they do it is another matter. Ava smiled slightly. They will. How do you know? Because you didn't give them a way to look away. Amara closed her eyes, then opened them again. We've been invisible too long, she said. Now they'll have to see us at 35,000 feet and rising, downstairs. A security guard passed by carrying a newspaper. On the front page was a screenshot of the video. Amara standing in the aisle, Gerald pointing a finger. The caption read, Flight of Reckoning Airline CEO stands ground in sky-high showdown. And beneath it, in smaller print, the chairwoman's post sparks national debate on bias in the skies. The moment had broken out of the cabin, and now the world was listening. At 7:02 a.m., the boardroom lights flickered to life like an ancient ritual unfolding. A light mist clung to the Manhattan skyline outside the tall windows, softening the jagged edges of concrete and glass. Inside, everything was sharp. 12 members of the board sat in silence, phones face down, no coffee, no side conversations, just one agenda item on the screen: Vote Operation Altitude, Implementation and Disclosure Policy. Amara sat at the far end, calm but unreadable. She didn't plead, she didn't pitch, she simply waited. Bryce Halloway cleared his throat. This vote will determine whether we move forward with Chairwoman Jennings' proposal in full. That includes the transparency reports, the crew retraining, the discrimination response unit, and the real-time accountability dashboard. His voice was even Say yes if you believe this is not only necessary, but urgent. Say no if you believe the risk outweighs the benefit. One by one. The votes came in. Yes, yes, no, yes, yes, no. Yes, yes, yes. Amara didn't flinch. Then came Monica Graham. She had remained quiet for most of the previous night's meeting. Her legal advice had always been guarded, precise, sometimes maddening in its neutrality. But now she raised her head. Yes, she said, and I'll volunteer to help design the safeguards. It was over. 9-3. Operation Altitude had passed. Amara didn't smile. She just looked down for a moment, inhaled, then looked back up, steady as sunrise. Thank you, she said softly. This is just the beginning. Later that afternoon, she stood at the observation deck of the North Atlantic Flight Training Center. A pair of cadets in crisp uniforms were running drills on the tarmac below. The hum of jet engines formed a soft, constant rhythm. She wasn't alone. An older man approached, slow but firm in his steps, with silver hair and a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. Lionel Pratt, she said. Turning. He nodded, his eyes warm behind his glasses. I came to say something I should have said a long time ago. He began. She waited. I was there, he said. That day in Boston, the boardroom. I didn't speak up when they laughed at you. Her gaze didn't waver. I remember. I wasn't brave then, he said, but I never forgot what you did after. You didn't storm out. You didn't beg. You just gave your presentation and let the silence judge them. She looked out at the tarmac. It took me years to realize that silence doesn't always judge. Sometimes it protects power. Lionel stepped closer. That's why I came. To tell you that what you're doing now, this isn't just justice. It's repair. She finally turned to him, eyes soft. Why now? Because I didn't want to be the kind of man who only applauds when it's safe. They stood in silence for a moment. I've been asked to lead the Internal Ethics Division, he said. Operation Altitude will need teeth. Amara smiled gently. You're hired. Meanwhile, across the country in Los Angeles, Gerald Whitmore was sitting under fluorescent lights in a rented podcast studio, preparing to go live on a conservative talk show called Skies of Truth. He wore a powder blue blazer, freshly pressed, with a white pocket square that looked like it belonged at a wedding. The host, a man named Trent Hollow, leaned into the mic. Today we've got the passenger himself, the man caught in the viral maelstrom, Mr. Gerald Whitmore. Gerald, welcome. Thanks. Trent, glad to finally tell my side. Trent nodded, cueing a dramatic sting. You were on the now infamous North Atlantic 2489 flight. What really happened? Gerald leaned forward, performing sincerity. I was simply concerned about seating confusion. The woman in 2A wasn't wearing a name badge. I politely asked if she was in the right seat. Trent jumped in. And you had no idea she was the CEO. None, Gerald said quickly. And frankly, I think she set it up. It felt performative. There's a pattern now where powerful people manufacture outrage to push agendas. What would you say to her if she were here right now? Gerald turned to the camera, faux regret in his voice. I'd say I'm sorry she felt offended. But I think she owes the public an apology, too, for abusing her influence and playing the victim. He sat back, satisfied. The chat stream below the live feed moved quickly. At first, a few supportive messages popped up. Then came screenshots. A woman named Alana posted a photo of Gerald in line at the gate, holding up a phone and laughing as he zoomed in on Amara's ticket. Another post surfaced a former co-worker who had filed a racial bias complaint against Gerald in 2019, then quietly resigned. Within minutes, the hashtags had changed. Gerald Whitmore. Apology not accepted. Gaslight Altitude, the show's live stream, was flooded with downvotes. Then, the feed cut out. Gerald turned to Trent. "What's going on?" Trent's producer entered. Pale. "We've been pulled. All sponsors dropped. This segment won't air again." Gerald stared, stunned. "I told the truth." He muttered, "No." The producer said flatly, "You told the version that kept you comfortable. Back in New York." Amara stood before a small circle of employees at the company's new leadership lab. She had invited flight attendants, engineers, customer care reps, and young interns, all voices that had been ignored for too long. "I want you to know something," she said, looking them each in the eye. "This company doesn't just fly planes. It carries expectations, and we've failed to carry all of them equally." She paused. "That ends now." A young man in uniform raised his hand. "What happens to the crew from that flight?" Amara's gaze softened. "They've been relieved," she said simply, "with an offer to retrain, if they're willing to unlearn, and if not, then they're free to leave." Another attendant asked, "Are we next?" Amara stepped forward. "No one is being hunted. But silence, bias, and indifference are no longer protected here." She folded her hands. "This is not a purge. It's a promise." The room held still. Then someone clapped, and others joined. Not loud applause, just steady, intentional, like a heartbeat returning. That night, as she sat in her apartment overlooking the Hudson, Amara finally allowed herself to exhale. She poured tea, turned off her phone, let her heels fall beside the couch. The quiet was earned. Her laptop chimed with a single notification, an email from her mother. It was short. "You walked with grace. Your grandmother would have wept." Amara leaned back, and for the first time in 3 days, she closed her eyes. The sky was still waiting, but now it had learned her name. The church was nearly empty, but the voice echoing through its vaulted sanctuary filled the space like thunder in a bottle. "I'm not saying you didn't do the right thing." "Amara," Pastor Ellis said, stepping down from the pulpit, "I'm saying you didn't do it for us." Amara sat in the front pew, her fingers laced in her lap. The calm she wore in boardrooms cracked slightly at the edges. Her eyes didn't rise. "I did it because it was right. That's the part that worries me," Ellis replied. "The part where right starts looking like solitude." A few others sat scattered in the pews behind her elders from the community. A handful of young professionals, an older woman who'd once taught Sunday school to her and her brother. They weren't hostile, but they weren't gentle either. She had come because they'd asked for a conversation, and she owed them one. Pastor Ellis paced slowly, hands behind his back. "You could have called someone. You could have talked to the MCP, to the Alliance Council, to any one of the dozen organizations that would have stood beside you. I didn't have time to wait for backup." He nodded, but didn't let up. "And now it's your name in lights, your face on the cover of magazines, your quote being dissected on cable news. I didn't ask for that, but you knew it would come." She finally looked up. "Would you rather I had stayed seated?" "Pastor," his eyes softened, but only slightly, "I would rather you remembered you are not alone in what you represent." That pierced deeper than she wanted to admit. Behind her, a woman in a gray shawl stood. "You remember Harold, don't you?" she asked gently. Amara nodded. "My cousin." Lost his job at Sky Tower after he reported a crew manager for calling him a quota. Harold didn't have a post to write. He didn't have a boardroom. He just had truth. And they buried him for it. Another woman stood, younger, in jeans and a flight operations badge. "I work ground crew at East Bay Terminal," she said. "Been there 6 years. Got called air janitor by a gate agent last week. You know what HR told me? To be less sensitive, maybe smile more." Amara swallowed. The younger woman nodded. "So yeah, what you did mattered. But now that you've burned it down, are you going to help us rebuild it? Or are we supposed to survive the smoke on our own?" The silence that followed was heavy with something more potent than judgment. It was expectation. Amara stood slowly. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped. "When I was 17, I applied to intern at Orion Skies. I typed up a resume on my mom's old Dell laptop, wore church shoes 2 sizes too tight, and took 3 buses across town to get there. I never heard back." She looked at each of them. 10 years later, I sat across from the man who ran that internship. He told me he remembered my name, said I sounded urban and didn't think I'd fit their culture. Her voice cracked, but she kept speaking. "So don't tell me I've forgotten who I am or who I came from. I carry it in every room I walk into. But sometimes you don't have the luxury of marching in a crowd. Sometimes they only open the door wide enough for one, and when that happens, your only job is to keep it from closing behind you." She paused. "And if I failed to tell you, that's what I was trying to do. I'm sorry." The younger woman exhaled. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. A little space in the air that hadn't been there before. Pastor Ellis nodded and stepped down to her level. "You know what my biggest fear was?" "Amara," he said quietly, "that you'd rise so high you'd forget how to kneel." She looked into his eyes. "Maybe it's time I kneel to build something that doesn't need me to stand on a pedestal." That night, Amara returned to her apartment and opened her laptop. She stared at the blinking cursor of a blank document, then began typing. She wrote the first draft of a new internal directive for North Atlantic. The opening sentence was simple. No title justifies silence. No rank absolves prejudice. Every voice matters. She sent it to Ava with the subject line, "For the people who don't have a jet." She leaned back, letting the soft glow of the city touch her face. She thought about Gerald, about Lionel, about Bryce and Monica, about her mother, about Harold, and Zoe. Zoe, who had messaged her again just this morning with a photo of her first paycheck as a junior flight assistant trainee. Underneath, it read, "You gave me wings." Amara stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed one more line in the document. "Dignity is not given. It's built seat by seat." The next day, North Atlantic Air announced the creation of the Wingspan Fellowship, a company-funded pipeline for marginalized youth to train, intern, and grow into leadership roles within the airline. Amara named it in honor of her late grandfather, Amara Jennings, a Tuskegee airman who had flown without ever being publicly thanked, within hours. Other airlines issued similar statements, some real, some performative, but the current had shifted. Gerald Whitmore released a second apology video. It had lower production value and no pocket square. This time, he looked directly into the camera. "I weaponized my discomfort," he said. "I thought I was defending tradition, but really, I was protecting a mirror I didn't want to look into. I don't ask for forgiveness. I ask for space to learn." Comments were divided. But Amara didn't respond, not because she didn't care, but because not every flame needs fanning. Some things heal better in the quiet. As the week came to a close, Amara prepared to board her next flight. No entourage, no press, just her, a carry-on, and a boarding pass that read 2A. The attendant at the gate smiled nervously when she approached. "Good morning, Ms. Jennings." Amara nodded kindly. "Just Amara today. On the plane." She paused in the aisle, looked around. The crew was diverse, young, old, black, white, brown. A woman in her 60s with silver braids wore a North Atlantic badge that looked newly earned. Amara took her seat. This time, no one asked her to move. No one mistook her for staff. But more importantly, no one assumed anything at all. The sky outside the window opened wide, and for the first time in a long time, Amara didn't feel like she had to brace for turbulence. She simply exhaled. 2 weeks later, the hangar smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The new North Atlantic Unity aircraft was parked at Gate 19 just beyond the glass windows of the terminal where the original incident had occurred. Its exterior shimmered in metallic cobalt and white, but it was the message emblazoned beneath the cockpit windows that held the most weight. The sky belongs to everyone. A ceremony was set to begin, with a modest crowd gathering. No media circus, no paparazzi, just employees, families, and members of the community Amara had quietly invited. She stood near the jetway, wearing a charcoal gray pantsuit and low heels, her badge clipped to her belt like any other crew member. Today, she wasn't above anyone. She was with them. Ava Ramsey joined her, holding a manila folder and a tight, anticipatory smile. "It's done," Ava said, handing over the folder. "The full report, the implementation schedule, and the accountability audits for the next year." Amara nodded, flipping through the first few pages before pausing at the last. At the bottom, in clean blue ink, was Ava's signature, and beside it, a second name, Monica Graham. "People don't always come back to the fire," Amara said softly. "Some run from it." Ava tilted her head. "Maybe we're just learning to use it right." Amara closed the folder and took a breath. Across the tarmac, a young boy in a wheelchair waved toward her. He wore a flight jacket 2 sizes too big and a smile so wide it outshone the jet behind him. Next to him stood his mother, a flight attendant Amara had personally reinstated after her complaint of racial retaliation had been dismissed by a former manager. She waved back, and suddenly, it all slowed down. The noise, the pressure, the politics, all of it faded under the quiet weight of what had been restored. Later that afternoon, Amara took a private walk back toward Gate 14, the gate where it all began. She paused outside the closed terminal, the shadows of her own past flickering in her peripheral. The bench was still there, the same metal seat where she had sat in silence, holding her boarding pass, when Gerald had told her, "You people always try to sneak into spaces you didn't earn." She lowered herself onto it. No entourage, no applause, just the hiss of the air vents and the low murmur of a departing flight in the background. She let the silence wrap around her like a familiar coat. She thought about everything that had happened since. The vote, the firings, the apology that never really came, the ones who had stood with her, the ones who had fallen silent, and the ones who had watched with folded arms, waiting for her to lose her temper, to become the angry black woman they expected. She never gave them that. But God, there were days she wanted to. Her thoughts drifted back to her grandfather, Elias Jennings, the Tuskegee airman who never got a parade, but who once told her, "You fight with dignity not because they deserve it, but because you do." She smiled, tears brimming but refusing to fall. The door behind her opened softly. She turned to see Zoe approaching now in her full North Atlantic trainee uniform, a lanyard dangling with her ID, and a clipboard hugged to her chest. "I saw you come in," Zoe said. "I didn't want to interrupt. She hesitated. Amara patted the bench beside her. Zoe sat, quiet at first. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Zoe asked. "The whole thing. The incident. The fallout. The spotlight." Amara thought carefully before speaking. "I don't regret what happened," she said. "I regret how often it still does." Zoe nodded slowly. "I used to be afraid of flying," she said. "Not because of the air, but because I never saw anyone who looked like me flying the plane or sitting in 2A. Amara turned to her, and now Zoe exhaled. "Now I know the seat isn't enough. We need the keys, too." That made Amara laugh, a soft, rich sound that echoed against the empty gate. "You're gonna do just fine." "Zoe," she said, "just don't forget to leave the door cracked when you make it all the way." Zoe smiled and stood, then paused. "Do you think we ever really land?" Amara looked up, thinking, sometimes, but other times. She motioned toward the window. "We just circle long enough to figure out where home is." That evening, in her office overlooking the Hudson, Amara pulled out a sheet of thick stationery. She wrote a single sentence in elegant script. "I didn't fire them to make a statement. I fired them to make room for someone better." She folded it, slipped it into an envelope marked, "To the next woman who's told she doesn't belong in first class," then tucked it into her desk drawer, right beside a laminated copy of her very first North Atlantic badge. No title, no gold trim, just her name, Amara Jennings. The final announcement came 2 days later. North Atlantic Air had launched the Skybridge Initiative, an equity-based policy and travel system to audit discriminatory patterns in customer treatment across all tiers of service. It was the first initiative of its kind. And this time, it wasn't just a press release, it was policy. On a quiet Sunday morning, Amara boarded a flight from New York to Jackson, Mississippi. Not for business, not for press, but for rest. She didn't sit in 2A. She sat in the very last row, beside a young girl traveling alone to visit her grandmother. They played cards in silence, smiled over ginger ale, and stared out the window at the clouds. The girl asked her if she worked for the airline. Amara nodded. "Yes," she said. "You could say that." The girl beamed. "Cool. I want to be a pilot one day." Amara looked out at the sky and back at her. "You will be," she said, and meant it. The flight soared steady into the clouds, and for the first time in a long time, Amara felt it. Not pride, not power, but peace. She had done what needed to be done, and left the sky just a little more open than she found it. Amara Jennings didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to threaten, or beg, or prove her worth to anyone. She simply stood in her truth. And in doing so, she grounded not just a flight, but an entire system of quiet, everyday injustice too many of us have learned to accept. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was a turning point, because behind every seat number, behind every gate agent, behind every policy written in fine print, there are people with stories, with struggle, with dignity. And when that dignity is denied, when it's stripped away simply because of who you are or what you look like, that's not a misunderstanding. That's a message. But so is Amara's calm, powerful defiance. So is her refusal to shrink. So is her decision to fire the ones who laughed and hire the ones who listen. Let her story remind us the sky belongs to everyone. And justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "Not today." If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, or made you think, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We have more true, powerful stories coming, stories that lift voices that were once silenced. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, never forget, your seat was never theirs to give.